Hi, good evening, everyone. I am McKenna. I'm the owner of Murder by the Book in Houston, Texas, and I'm happy to be on here tonight with two of my favorite authors, Cara Black and Naomi Hirahara. We're here to celebrate Naomi Hirahara's brand new book, Clark and Division, which is a wonderful, wonderful, highly recommended historical mystery. And for those of you who know us, you know how much we love Soho crime authors in general. So we're also having Cara Black here as our guest moderator, the author of the Aimée Leduc series, as well as her most recent book, 3 Hours in Paris. So if you're interested in more information about either of those authors, either of their books, I've dropped a link in the comments on Facebook and YouTube, and you can find out more information there, or if you're so inclined, order the books from us. We do have signed book plates for Clark and Division, and we probably actually have some signed book plates left from 3 Hours in Paris, which we'd be happy to send along with the paperback edition. And we have lots more events and authors this week. So if you are interested in seeing what's coming up, all of our events can be found on our Facebook event listing. They're current through the end of August. And we have all of them on our website as well, murderbooks.com. Some highlights: we have a pretty cool event, Lee Child and Paula Hawkins in conversation at the end of the month. That's a ticketed event, but some all sorts of stuff coming up in August and beyond that. So if you have questions, please put those in the live chat on YouTube or on in the comments on Facebook, and we'll get to them in a little bit. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and bring on our authors. Let's start with Naomi. Hi, Naomi. How are you?
Hello, everyone. I'm doing well. Thank you.
Congrats on another wonderful book. Let me go ahead and get your official introduction done, and then we'll bring on Cara. Naomi Hirahara is the Edgar Award-winning author of the Mas Arai mystery series, including Summer of the Big Bachi, which was a Publisher's Weekly Best Book of the Year and one of Chicago Tribune's 10 Best Mysteries and Thrillers. She's also the author of the LA-based Ellie Rush mysteries. A former editor of the Rafu Shimpo newspaper, she's co-written nonfiction books like Life After Manzanar and the award-winning Terminal Island, Lost Communities of Los Angeles Harbor. She now resides in Pasadena, California, and like I said, her new book is Clark and Division, and I can't wait to hear her talk about it this evening. We're also joined by Cara Black. Hi, Cara.
Hi.
Good to see you. Yeah, excellent. Thank you. I was admittedly a little under the weather, nothing serious, yesterday and today, so I don't have a prop book tonight. So I'm glad that you do. Cara Black is the author of 19 books in the New York Times bestselling Aimée Leduc series. She has received multiple nominations for the Anthony and Macavity Awards, and her books have been translated into German, Norwegian, Japanese, French, Spanish, Italian, and Hebrew. She lives in San Francisco with her husband and son and visits Paris frequently. And in a little bit, I'm going to go ahead and give you a chance to talk just for a second about 3 Hours in Paris, since you're so generously on here to interview Naomi this evening. But for now, I'm going to sit back, relax, enjoy the show. If anything goes wrong, technical issues, any questions, just call me right back and I will magically appear. Have fun.
Thank you. Thank you, McKenna.
Bye, McKenna.
Thank you, Murder by the Book, a store
Yes.
we love. And our publisher.
Yes, definitely.
But I want to say konnichiwa and bonsoir, okay? Get that out of the way.
Yeah, sounds good.
So I'm thrilled to talk with you, Naomi, and I love Clark and Division. Really, I think this is a standout book. But don't listen to me. I mean, let's read the New York Times review on Sunday, the article in the LA Times. Of course, you're a local girl there, but Seattle Times. I mean, it's just across the board. And I have to say, first off, I was born in Chicago. I was born on the South Side. I never heard anything about this history that you talk about.
Yeah.
And right, I mean, my family stories were about unions and about, gangsters. But tell us about this. I mean, and I've heard you, I know you've been working on this for a while, but I mean, this little known history of Chicago. Tell us, please, where this came from.
It's not unusual that you haven't heard it, Cara. And even some of the descendants of the people who lived in this intersection of Clark and Division, which was And one of the early places where Japanese Americans who were released from the detention camps went to. And many of them went like during World War II, because the governments told the Japanese Americans who are going to be released, they said, do not congregate, do not, hang around, and as a reason, but the ironic thing is, you get a bunch of Californians who were in a detention center, and then you plop them down in the second biggest city, because at the time it was the second biggest city in United States, with its notorious past and time. And then, of course, people are going to stick together, right? Because this is this foreign place for them. On one hand, the government's saying don't stick together, but of course people are going to stick together, but officially they're not supposed to exist. So as a result, there's no like Chicago, Little Tokyo, or community like we see in Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Jose, parts of Washington State. And so the first people who are released, because they had to kind of pass this loyalty test or say that they have a sponsor in Chicago, were the Nisei, the second generation, and they were young. The average age were people in their mid-20s. So you get a bunch of young people who were locked up and now released. What are they going to do? They're going to, sow their oats. They don't have parents that are supervising them, and they're trying to navigate, right, this very weird transition. It's kind of like us in the pandemic. We're kind of, okay, now you could go outside, but you're not really quite sure how to do things. But a lot of young people wanted to party and get together. So it's kind of that contrast, right? There's the trauma that they experience, but they're young people. So there's this optimism, this search for fun, for romance, all those elements. And they're all kind of, they intersect together at Clark and Division. Right.
I see such a parallel, nowadays. But also that they were displaced. I mead let's talk about the Ito family, which is Aki's family. They were displaced twice. It's not uncommon. First, they had to leave their business. Her father had to give up kind of his identity, right, in his produce company. Her mother, they were kind of middle class. They had something, they had a home, they had dishes that matched, which we bring out later. And then they're displaced. They lose everything. They go to a camp. And then because of Aki's older sister, Rose, they get to go to Chicago, which is this whole other ballpark, So this idea of displacement and, people trying to find their way is just so prevalent in the story. And, Aki is such a great character. I love that Aki, this young woman who's 20 years old, is not a victim. Can you talk about that? Because she makes mistakes like any 20-year-old does, but Aki is, driven. She's really driven throughout this story.
The book starts with her birth. And what's kind of interesting is you don't really learn her name until a few pages, but Rose, the older sister, she takes center stage even during Aki's birth. But Aki is born breech, which is unusual. So it's kind of a hint to the readers, like, she may be underestimated. She may be kind of in the shadow of her, very beautiful older sister. But, Aki is an outlier. And the thing I love about our genre, Cara, just the mystery genre, is because there is some, earth-shattering kind of crime or tragedy, it really makes our protagonists, they have to have agency. Yeah. They can't just passively, or you don't have much of a detective or crime book, right? If our protagonist just crumples or is catatonic or is passive, I think our genre demands that our protagonists do something. So that's why I love the mystery genre. And so Aki is, within this this confine, and she, so she is really fueled by, she has to find the truth. It's just, that's how she's been from the very beginning. She doesn't really, although maybe may not articulate everything that's going on in her mind. I mean, that's what the book is about too, her journey to find her voice and own it. But certainly internally, she is driven to, no matter the cost, whereas people around her, they're trying to be protective. They've been through a traumatic experience. But for her, she doesn't care. She needs to, for the sake, in memory of her sister, her beloved sister, she needs to find out the truth of what this personal trauma that has happened to the family.
And then she has to survive, and her family have to. Everyone has to survive. They're kind of clawing their way, like the parents cleaning offices or barbershops. But also, I mean, the thing about Aki is that she is curious. She says that several times. And I'm thinking about, who do I know that's curious like her? Oh, maybe Naomi, who was a journalist, right? I don't know, is there something of Aki, something of you and Aki? Because she's definitely curious, and she sticks her nose around, in different places. So,
well, I think the thing that I really resonate with Aki is there's scenes when she's in LA. She's from this town. The Ito family's from a community called Tropical, and it's present day, kind of the border of a city called Glendale in Los Angeles. And there's times where she's walking her dog Rusty, and that was like me walking my dog during the pandemic, and just kind of these things like twirling around in her mind. So I think that she's a woman. She's not surrounded by a lot of friends, in fact, because she was raised middle class in a white area, she doesn't really have that many super close friends. So she's just learned that she has to kind of process things by herself. Mm-hmm. And that kind of follows her in Chicago. She's probably interacting with more people, her peers, than ever any other time in her life. So that kind of leads to interesting things.
Right, and gets a job, which she didn't have to before. She just worked in her, it's quite a step. We see her grow and blossom, yet there's always this self-doubt. And also, growing up in the shadow of her older, beautiful sister, the accomplishments. And of course, sometimes I think we sort of see at the end, maybe a lot of that was her own internalizing. And yet when she notices, one time she wears one of Rose's dresses, and how people notice her, not just men who do, but women, other women too. And I know you're giving voice to a Nisei woman here, but there's such a universality I felt. I really could resonate, a little sister, always want to be with, emulating her older sibling, people who are displaced, families who maybe don't communicate well, who don't communicate their emotions. Talk about that, because there's one quote I love that sort of talks about that. Page 10. Can I quote that? Mm-hmm. Page 10, where I don't want to give too much away, but something about by this time we understood how the world worked for us. To articulate the attitudes against us would give them power and credence. We preferred to release the pain silently, let it rise in invisible balloons that we couldn't see but we could feel. I mean, wow, that sort of says kind of how it's internalized, but it's also not giving the power to the word,
Yeah, that, our editor, Julia Grams, she she lit the fire under me when I was writing this. I mean, I think, because in some sense, I'm a Nisei too, because my mother's an immigrant from Japan. So I think there's some cultural values, and just growing up, I grew up in the 60s and 70s here, and that it was not cool to be of Japanese ancestry. It is cool now with Pokemon Go and anime and all those, and everyone loves sushi, right? But it wasn't the case, you know. And then when my mother would speak to me in Japanese in public, I would say, "No, Mom, English." Because that was the time of, you know, the cheap transistor radio made in Japan. We didn't think of that it's like good quality, right? So I think I was, you know, dealing with my own, you know, microaggressions or just what people would say to me, feeling like inferior, but not acting out, you know, on it. In some ways, I'm a traditional daughter. And I think I probably share that with Aki in that we're protective of our immigrant parent because we're negotiating the outside world for our parent, you know. So we're kind of parenting our parent in a weird way. So there's like all of those things, you know, are in play. But yeah, I wanted to say a couple of things about what you just said. One was, so I did not like that paragraph you read, like I wouldn't necessarily elaborate what Aki was thinking, because I think as a Nisei, you just learn, you're just trying to survive. You're just trying to do things and act, you know, even though Aki is a thoughtful person, you know, there's you just learn, it's kind of like skipping from one stone to another in water, you know, you just learn to do that, and you're not really articulating, you know, the space in between those stones. So I had to do that. Juliet kind of pushed me, and then I was going, oh, okay. But there were other things, just regular things like her being a younger sister. I don't have a sister. You know, I'm the oldest sister.
Right.
To my younger brother. So I had to interview. So this is where my journalism came in. I had to interview my friends who are younger sisters to get a better hold on that. And then one last thing, there is a connection to Murder by the Book, because there had been a small press, Busted Flesh Press, that was connected to Murder by the Books. And Megan Abbott had she had edited a collection called Hell of a Woman. And that was my first time to try to capture a Nisei voice. But I made it was totally noir. And then this former beauty queen in the 1950s, she's married, but gets involved with a white real estate agent. And its story ends where he's chopped up in little pieces in a suitcase and then dumped in the ocean. No, but some people really like those kind of endings. But I knew people who were Nisei or who had a Nisei parent or aunt. They couldn't relate to the story. So Clark and Division is kind of my quest. Like, how do I capture an ordinary voice, not necessarily a deranged person, I mean, she has gone through historic trauma, but still make it an engaging story. And so that was my challenge.
Oh, well, and you succeeded beautifully. I mean, it's really, I love this book, and I'm not the only one, and many other people will when they read it. But yeah, you capture that universality. And, you know, the family too. I mean, it just, there's something else I want to say, but I don't want to jump ahead on that. There's another quote I really liked on page 18. We had to cross an unknown body of water in a rickety rowboat. If we paused to cry or ask questions, we were bound to sink. And I think that was beautifully put, and I'm so glad you were pushed on that by our editor. But I think that captures immigrants. You know, you can't stop. You've got to keep going. You've got to put the food on the table. You've got to, you know, have enough for the bus to get to I don't think there's the luxury of grief, they might say. I mean, right? You have to keep moving to stay above water, which is a cliche.
And then we think about, this was in the 40s. This is before the civil rights movement.
Yep.
You know, the civil rights movement has changed our society, and we now, you know, I think we appreciate speaking out when we see and experience injustice. But this is like 30 years, you know, 25 years before that. So I think that's important to keep that in mind as well.
Definitely, definitely. And my one last quote page 281, and it's not really going to give anything away, but I really love this because I thought this is really how she feels, because there's more of that coming out in the story. I never considered saying how I felt about things. How could I, when I always seemed to be grasping in the darkness to understand where I stood? Love that. And I think that is so Aki. It shows us where she's come from. I think, but any one of us can really, empathize with that. Maybe we've all been there one time or the other, or that's a great way of putting it and seeing where she's coming from and where she's come to. She's made huge growth.
Yeah, I mean, it could be like our station in life, our birth order, our personality, I know for me, my husband is Japanese American too, but he's third generation. And I know in the early years of our marriage, it was like it's personality, it's all these things. But he's like, well, he's also a counselor, so he's more in tune with his emotions. So he would always say how he felt, like if he was feeling sick, if he was feeling depressed. And I'm like going, oh my, God, there's just too much emotion being articulated here. Like, just suck it up, because that was just the way I was raised, and then you don't even know that you have that kind of perspective until you're intimate with another person with a different perspective. And it's like, oh, I don't have to live life in the way I've been living. I could kind of choose, because I don't think it's good. I think especially in America, it's better if you articulate it, I think.
Well, can we also talk about, in Chicago, we've got Art Nakasone, the romantic interest. Boy, he's a hunk. And but what about him? Because he has a different experience. He grew up in the Midwest. And let's face it, as a Chicago-born person, we're really friendly Midwestern hospitality. And I really saw it in the Nakasone home. But they have matched China, and they have everything that Aki lost. And yet, there's animals, there's pets, there's family members, there's busyness, like a real family. I love Art's father when she walks in and he goes, oh, hi, how are you? And gets back to work, as men do, right? But I love that, contrast, it's a different kind of experience, probably not the hugest, but, and that's something Aki realizes her loss,
Well, it just shows you how nonsensical, like the whole, incarceration of Japanese Americans. Like, why wasn't there wholesale mass incarceration of people, Japanese Americans in Hawaii? Pearl Harbor happened in Hawaii. There were some selected number who were taken away, but not everyone, and then they're taken to the Midwest to work at defense plants. If these are such dangerous people, why are you encouraging them to work in Detroit and Chicago? There's do not compute. And then these young men, are being drafted in the U.S. Army. So, and I think I like the contrast of Art and Aki. And I think when Aki sees Art, she's thinking, that's my family. That's how we were in California. So
yeah. And the really interesting thing, and I know you've talked about this in other interviews, but I just wanted to bring up the 442nd Regiment, the combat team of Nisei and Japanese Native Americans who fought in World War II. My husband used to work at Kinokuni at the Japanese bookstore and met some of these men from the 442nd Regiment, which I hope I got the name right, and they'd written books and they would come and do talks. And they said to him, and he can't remember the name, that they went and liberated Dachau, that German concentration camp, and breaking off the locks of whatever, yet their families were in concentration camps here in America, in Manzanar or wherever.
Yeah.
Yet they fought the hardest. They were the most, they were out to not only to prove themselves, but they loved this country, and yet they had to go and do that while their own family was in a camp.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my late father-in-law was with the 100th 442. So yeah, I mean, and actually I kind of put him, there's an Easter egg. I put him in the book in a way.
Okay.
So it's kind of fun. I won't elaborate. It's like for people who've read the book, later on they could come to me and they could, I have an alarm. Cara, you talk right now because I have to turn off this one alarm. I'll be right back.
Yeah, okay.
I'll be right back.
So actually, Naomi made this really cute TikTok video, which I don't know how to do, about all the times we've known each other for at least a decade or more, but when we were in LA, and some of them are famous people who we count as friends, Michael Conley, Denise Hamilton, who's a, Angelino, and also a journalist. So, so check out the TikTok. It's on your Facebook author page. It's so cute. Anyway, okay, that was filler. Okay, there's one quote. It's not in your book. I saw it and it really made me think of your book. It says this was called "The War at Home That Was Never Fought." To be racism and prejudice, and the real war is the aftermath back at home. Because there's a lot that just think this is 1944 and where we're at, but it's kind of, when you talked about, it wasn't 30 years before there was civil rights. I mean, there's a long road to hoe, after this. I mean, World War II, of course, we were not invaded. We were not occupied like Europe, but it just gave me pause to think, when you look at history.
Actually, some Japanese Americans were still in camp at the end of 1945. Like around Thanksgiving. So that's like, the war ended in August. They had nowhere to go. These were the most impoverished people, like the old people or people with young children. And they literally had no place to go. So, so that's really disheartening, And another thing with Clark and Division, everyone has a different response. Uh-huh. It's not a some people, are so happy to be in Chicago. And the reason why I put the Newberry Library in there was a friend, Sue Kunitomi Embry. She's passed, but she was an educator and civil rights leader. She fought for Manzanar to be a National Historic Site. But she went from Manzanar and she worked at the Newberry Library. And she said that it was a positive experience for her because that was probably the first time that she was with people of other ethnicities.
Right.
So it was very eye-opening for her. So, everybody has their different take. So I think that's what's fun to write, like a mystery with a lot of characters. So you're not just, of course, it's from, Aki's point of view, but I think you can see that every character has a legitimate, viewpoint as well.
Right, and they all have different reactions. All the two women that she works with, one woman from the Polish community, and we see them reacting to what happens and what she does. And the other woman, Buck, talks about her community. And I really liked her development. Phyllis, is that Phyllis? Mm-hmm. Phyllis, who was very standoffish at the beginning, but things changed. I won't say much, but I really liked that. I liked that the kind of zoot suiters. Is that what you call them? The guys who wear the zoot suits, because they have them in Paris too. The zoot suit with the hair and the big flashy suits, and really, and then the Christian people, and how just to say something about how funerals were so important, and they were part of the tradition, and it was a way to maybe bring order, maybe to bring how things used to be. We still have this tradition where people gather and then they contribute the money into the envelope. Many cultures do that, but it was so important in paper shortage, and did they have enough to write a thank you? And wonderful, just incredible details that so made you really think about that. How do you carry your tradition and culture on?
Yeah, and I think it's sometimes that's the only thing that keeps you sane, you know, that little sliver, that little cultural practice, you know, and probably in the pandemic, we've been looking for that too. You know, I think more people are writing letters and, you know, doing very sensory things, you know, baking bread, you know, just
making bread. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Baking.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting. When you think about and about the candy factory, I had no idea there was a candy factory near the Chicago Tribune, where my grandfather used to work as an electrician. I mean, I had no idea. You know,
Yeah, it was a very big operation. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
now you're kind of a mapaholic, right? Are you afflicted as me? Yeah.
I don't think I'm as afflicted as you, but I do, you know, that's the only thing that I kind of bemoan, like GPS. I mean, because I love to read maps, and I think reading a map just helps center me, makes me understand like where I need to go and all those kind of things. I mean, for the longest time, even Google Maps, I was like one of those weird old people. I would print it out, you know, I'd print out the map instead of just look it on my phone. But yeah, so, and I love eBay. I don't know if you get a lot of things from eBay, but I got a lot of old Chicago maps, you know, from because it's mid-century, so it's doable. So I would get those kind of things. Postcards were really helpful because they're of that era, and then I could read like what people wrote, you know, so some of them were actually sent off. And then also it's nice because you could see illustrations of, like, I have one building called the Mark Twain Hotel, which really exists and is one of the buildings that still exists today. But because it's in a postcard and a drawing, it's in color, you know, instead of getting these black and white photos. And the book, I think, Cara, you don't have the final book. You have the ARC.
I have the ARC.
Yeah, you open this, it's like, ooh, you know, this beautiful map of Clarkin Division.
Oh,
and
gorgeous.
I really relied on a local historian. He's a friend, Eric Matsunaga. And, you know, I think every town of a certain subculture has that social historian, right? The person who just gets high on the talking to old people about where they grew up. And Eric is he's younger than me, but he just loves this stuff. And he's half Japanese, half Polish. And that was another interesting thing with the Midwest, because a white person could marry a Japanese person, which was not allowed, right? In California.
Our state, in California.
So we pride ourselves in California. We are so open and blah, blah, blah. But, you know, the most, you know, virulent, you know, anti-Asian legislations and Asian laws, you know, were birthed in our state, right? And the miscegenation laws too. You know, you could not marry your husband, right, Cara?
Yeah,
it was early. If it was earlier. And actually, white women who married, like an Issei, someone from Japan, was born in Japan, who are white American women, they could possibly, some of them lost their citizenship for a short amount of time. And so they had to really lobby for that not to happen. So that was very interesting as part of the Midwest kind of history. But anyway, yeah, so Eric took me on a walking tour. And I'll tell you one reason why I decided to focus on Clarkin Division, because there were other communities. There were some Japanese Americans in the South Side, and some in other parts. But Clarkin Division was the first, and it was very chaotic. It was a way station. People didn't stay there. And I think
a center, right? They sort of came and they got a place to live or look for jobs, right? So kind of like a way station, right? So they come, they move on. Yeah, I got that. That's
And
Sorry.
I felt like as a Los Angelino, because I don't live in Chicago. I mean, to write this book, I took 2 research trips, but it's kind of audacious. Why is this Los Angelino writing about Chicago? But so many people actually returned to LA, and I knew the people. I've talked to them, so I think that gave me more confidence. So many people actually left anyway, and if you go to Chicago Clark Division today, it's not much is left. There's like a big, drugstore. There's a LA tanning salon. There's a few, historic buildings, but much of what was there before is gone. So even if
tracks or anything,
no,
Wow.
that was actually the most shocking to me, because I think in Los Angeles and San Francisco, and the Pacific Northwest, I think we see more the plaques of what this used to be. And in terms of Asian American history, I didn't see that. So I thought that was it. So that's one of the reasons why I wrote Clark Division too. So
you had to be a detective, you really had to search that out. Yeah.
So to bring it to light, and there's some great Japanese American historians in Chicago, and I think hopefully this will just help elevate their work, and they can talk more of what happened in the 1950s and later years.
And you've got this great bibliography, more reading and resources at the end too, which really, is fantastic and makes me want to read this. And you mentioned Eric here in that story, and even give his email. But yeah, I mean, I love how again, I want to bring this back to Aki because she just really pulled me along, and a young woman who's kind of finding her self-worth in the most worst time. I mean, she could have sank, right? I mean, she could have, but she bobbed to the surface, right? I mean, she could have gone either way, as well as the Itos, right? I mean, they had, her father, had drinking issues, and of course, and maybe they had PTSD, though no one called it that then, right? But I mean, they didn't necessarily have to rise, and fight their way to the top. I mean, they did, right? But
I think one thing, again, about the mystery genre, because there is some sort of tragedy that usually occurs in our books, like in the beginning, and our protagonists are they're trying to untangle that or deal with it. I think it brings certain issues to light that, like, maybe these other families, they're just will go on with their lives, and kind of like the sections you read, they're kind of push, these feelings, these more uncomfortable, dark feelings aside, and kind of just keep going, right? And it may not be until decades later. And we actually found that with when redress and reparations movement was going on in the 1980s, and these Issei, the first generations or Nisei, would come and they would testify in front of Congress about what happened, and they would just totally break down. And their descendants said they had never heard their parents talk about that. So I think that's one of the advantages of our genre. Like, Aki doesn't have the luxury of waiting to wrestle with this. She has to wrestle with it now. So that makes her different, I think, than her peers.
Right. There's a mystery she has to solve, and she has to find things out. And I just want to say, I think the ending of the book justifies that famous saying, "Come to Chicago, vote with us, vote early and often." They don't forget that theme. It's very Chicago. Vote early and vote often. Right?
And every actually criminal incident is actually based on a true incident, really. Yeah.
How did you find? Did you go into the police files or the paper or?
Actually, it was more. I started with academic books, on different topics, and it just. You probably find this too, Cara, where it's serendipitous. Like you
Yep.
kind of are interested in something and you start reading and it's like, oh my gosh. And then it just, it just leads you. It's like a slide and the ending place is just where you need to go. And that's kind of what happened. And then from there, I was able to do research on newspapers and that kind of thing.
Mhm.
And I did
Right.
look at some police, there was some, and again, it's incredible. Like I'm in Los Angeles, but when you could, luckily I was doing this research before the pandemic, and I
Mhm.
can get books about Chicago Police Department from the 1930s, the
Right.
actual book from the library. And so
Yeah.
I was doing that kind of thing. Yeah.
Thank you, Link Plus libraries, right? Yeah, I've used the same thing during pandemic. Yeah, I've often, my book, I found a footnote in a history book, which I was not looking at it, and I went like, yes, it was this footnote, and I was like, there's more here. It's down the rabbit hole after that, but then I found a landing place. But yes, and the archives. I mean, I love to go to the archives in Paris or wherever and smell the dust, touch these things. Sometimes you have to touch them with, gloves on, but when you think of who touched all those things, it's just incredible. But you still have living people, right? You talk to, and that's great,
I think McKenna's saying that we have some questions.
Oh, well, I'm glad. I'm not doing my host job. Excuse me, I've been left.
No, everything's great. It's been a wonderful conversation, but we do have some questions. So this is a pretty good time for me to come back on. And before we get to those questions, I just want to give Cara a second to talk about 3 Hours in Paris, which is out in paperback.
Yeah. Thank you, McKenna. Yeah, just what Naomi said really sparked. 3 Hours in Paris came from the footnote I found in a French history book that said Hitler came to Paris for 3 hours. And then he left and he never returned. And he came with, this whole contingent of people. And I was like, why would you do that? And that sparked my story. And why would this man who didn't even have a parade on the Champs-Élysées when the city was his, didn't? And I quickly read the accounts of the two of the men that were with him. There's a picture of Hitler with Albert Speer on one side and Arno Brecker on the other, the architect and the artist. And they both wrote, with him on this trip. They both wrote accounts after the war, after prison, and they both gave different dates of this visit. And I went, there's the story. And our editor, Juliet, said, well, you've got all those notebooks that you take, of all the things you learn when you go to Paris. And, you've got all this World War II history that doesn't fit in the Aimée Leduc books. Get to work. And I thought I have, which I think Naomi has for many, many years amassed a lot of, knowledge and anecdotes and stories about that. And I've sort of picked those things up about World War II because I'm kind of fascinated. And it just sort of came together. And but I have a character who's a female assassin because I was tired of reading about male assassins, okay? And we needed a female who had nothing to lose, who after tried to surmount her tragedy and, ends up maybe, preventing Britain being invaded. I'm just saying, but, preventing Operation Sea Lion from happening. All real things. But I think as we do in the mystery genre, it's that what if? What if there was, what if Hitler was actually assassinated, or, there was an assassination attempt against him in the 3 hours? And with mystery, we can do that, we can really delve into that. So, yeah, I love writing about 1940 Paris, and you're in 44 Chicago, but I love dipping back in time. I personally love that. Hear the music, the fashions. I forgot to ask you about fashions, but maybe someone else will. But
but if you want to talk a little bit about fashions, Naomi, I know both of you probably have infused your books with that. And I will say as readers, I know it's interesting at the store, the section that has the fastest turnover. So, you could argue most popular section of the store is our historical mystery section. And I think it's because, we read and learn at the same time, and they're just so wonderful, especially now to be able to escape reality. So both of these are highly recommended. Why don't y'all talk about fashion for just a second, and then we'll get to the questions.
Well, those dresses that she wears, you know, with the heron or the with the bird design. I went, you know, I loved, and then talk about that. Where did you find that? I could see it with the shoulder pads and the ruffle or whatever. I love that. You know,
I mean, that's where the internet really comes in handy. I think for me, actually, the hairstyles were really pivotal, because when I would see like historic photos of people in camp, like their hair was immaculate, you know, beautiful. And one thing, and I talked to Eric Matsunaga about this last week, because I think I have a line in there that they didn't want to look miserable in their situation. They didn't want the government they didn't want to give people the satisfaction. So I think it was like an issue of dignity, you know, and presentation. So, yeah, and just like the pin curls, you know, I was like doing a lot of research on those kind of things. In terms of fashion for, like, this is where the yearbooks, you know, from like 1940 really came in handy, because it's one thing like what a 30-year-old would wear, but what were like 20-year-old girls or high school girls. So once I cracked open, well, digitally, you know, the yearbooks, you know, I could see the plaid, you know, the type of shoes, the saddle, you know, yeah, and all those kind of things. Yeah. So, you know, how about you, Cara? How about you?
Just what you said about the dignity. French woman, and I used the line in 3 Hours in Paris, but a French woman, you know, when when Kate is there in Paris, and she's looking at the women, and she just came from London, which is full of, you know, blitz. The blitz is going on, and she sees women with stockings that have seams, you know, like silk stockings, and their hair is done up, and they're wearing lipstick, you know, and she said, well, you know, like back in England, you know, people are standing in lines, you know, rationing hadn't started in Paris then, but they'd already been rationed in London for several months. And, you know, women weren't getting all dolled up to wait in line for 7 hours, but, you know, and she talks about that, and she's really feeling that they're just, you know, here I am to help France and to kill the Boche, but here are the French women like this. And later she meets a French woman who is, you know, helping her apply makeup and giving her the silk lingerie to go in disguise, and she makes a remark, and she goes, "This is how we resist the Boche. You know, we will not let them see us look, you know, downtrodden and, you know, a mess, and we are showing them, you know, that we have our dignity, and they will never conquer this, even they took our country." So I think that's really the same thing. You have people who express themselves, you know, and the hair, and they had to wear these wooden clogs, you know, because there was no more leather anymore, and there were no more regular shoe factories. It was all for the war. It was for soldiers' boots. So they had to wear these clumpy, you know, Dansko clogs, right, which are fashionable now. But they didn't like wearing them then, because that's all they could wear, you know. But you have to think about what they had to do, and in winter, wearing those thick wool socks and trying to look chic with what you have, and be warm, waiting in line for all these things. I think it was a statement of resistance too.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we have a little time, so we have some questions very specifically for Naomi. What was the most challenging part and most inspiring part of writing Clark and Division?
I think probably the challenge, I mean, I was dealing with histories on different level, because it starts in Los Angeles and then goes into camp in Manzanar and then to Chicago. So I'm kind of dealing with 3 different histories. So that was daunting, but on the, and I, like I was telling Cara, you know, I don't live in Chicago, and I know everybody in those 3 places are going to have a very strong opinion if I get things wrong. But I think the other part of the question was what was
inspiring.
the most
what was most challenging? What was most inspiring?
I think in terms of inspiring, I think actually I was inspired by Aki's mother, even though, you know, she had her own agenda, but that, and, you know, our characters just do things, right? And she was a very proud, the thing about the Ito family, they're very proud, but the mother has to do janitorial, you know, she has to do cleanup work. But she, you know, I thought at first when I was writing it, it would be very pitiful kind of thing, but she had pride about what she, and she had this expectation that her daughter, you know, should not look down on what she did as, you know, domestic work either, or cleanup work, janitorial work. So that inspired me, you know, and it was unexpected. And I go, okay, you know, even though, you know, she says the regular mother things like, why don't you get married? You know, all those kind of things. But there's another side to the mother that, yeah, I was impressed with.
Yeah. The same person has another question. What was the most helpful feedback you received during the revision or editing process of this book?
I think, you know, Juliet's comments, of course, were the most helpful. I'm trying to think. There were little things. And, you know, what I would advise, I don't know how many people you had read your book, Cara, your historical, but I had quite a few people. I needed more women. Unfortunately, there were mostly men who read my book, but it was like Japanese American scholars, and then there were, you know, people in Chicago. You know, and I think it was interesting because every single person came up with something different that I needed to address, but they didn't catch. You know, they didn't catch the same thing. So I was going, this is very difficult. Our colleague, James Ben. Thank you, James. Okay, so this is what I did that was wrong, that was caught on the arc. I had Aki open a beer. It was a tab. They didn't have tabs back then.
Right.
A beer can. Right. So that was my big historic, but luckily we fixed it. But everyone, there's been at least 5 people who've read the arc, who've like emailed either me or someone else, you know, Juliet, or to say, oh, by the way, Naomi, you know, you really made a big mistake here. It's like, we caught it. And thank God, because if it went out, I would be having hundreds of emails right now telling me that I made a big error there.
Totally. Can I just add? So I went to lunch with Reese Bowen, Jackie Winspear. I mean, this was before the pandemic, like before Christmas, because we all used to live around here. And so I had the arc, and I was telling Reese something about taking the train down from Scotland to London. And she said, which station? I said, oh, well, Pancras, where you go now. She goes, no. It's King's Cross. It's the other one. And I went, what? I called Juliet from the restaurant and said, please take out that, because in 1940, they would be arriving from Scotland here. And she did. So that was last minute too. Thank God for Reese Bowen. But who would have called me on it if they'd gotten it wrong? But yeah, we're lucky in the community. We have people that will say, ah.
Yeah. So I would say, don't worry. I mean, be free. For those of you who are working on historical fiction or any kind of fiction, just feel free to have readers, you know, don't feel, you know, too sensitive about that, because they could really save you.
So we have a couple questions about forthcoming projects. One very specifically, this person watching learned from another interview, Naomi, that there's a second book after Clark and Division. What time period will this cover, and is the setting going to be a different location? Now, that being said, we have someone who's just asked both of you what you're working on and what's next. So we'll get to Cara also. But if you want to address what we're going to be seeing in that second Clark and Division book.
So this is a follow-up. It's not necessarily a series, but it's called Evergreen, and it's going to take place in 1946. And for those who are in the know, Evergreen is an area in Boyle Heights in Los Angeles. So that's all I'll say.
Nice.
That's all I'll say. How about you?
I wanted to ask you that. But okay, we finished the next Aimée Leduc. It's called Murder at the Porte de Versailles. Comes out March 2022. It's done and dusted, but we don't have the cover yet. And I'm working on the next Kate. Kate
Oh, great.
Yeah, that's the title. Kate Do. We don't know.
All right.
Thank you for asking.
And then I think we'll end with this question. And let's make it also about Cara for 3 Hours in Paris. So did you change personally or professionally as a result of writing Clark and Division? And Cara, have you found yourself changing from one of your books or 3 Hours in Paris?
To change as a person.
It says personally or and professionally. How do you think you've changed as a result of writing Clark and Division, personally and professionally?
This is kind of a deep question.
It is a deep question.
And my book just came out last week.
And if you haven't changed because it's fiction, fine. Like that's an answer too. Yeah. But are there any ways that you think you've changed?
I think that I will say this. It's taken. It was funny because when Soho was doing my bio, they said Naomi Hirahara has taken her 35 years of research and put it into this book. And then I was going, 35 years? That sounds incredible. But then I thought about when I started working at the Japanese American newspaper and had been, at least that amount of time, and all those interactions and all those stories I was doing did inform this book. So I think, one thing is just personally, I just love that this is my first official hardcover. I've had a few hardcovers here and there, but I consider this my first hardcover, and it's just so I also enjoy being a paperback original author. Just I like that it's so accessible, and inexpensive for people. I do like that aspect, and it's just some of my books, especially the more recent ones, are like frothy in front. You go to Hawaii, you go, but in a sense, all those books help me to get to this, and I just love to make like a beautiful object in addition to the story. It's very fulfilling. And so, yeah, in a way, I think everything I've done, both nonfiction and fiction, has kind of, permeated and kind of been not dumped, but kind of, dumped into. Yeah. So it's satisfying. And I will say this, I'm surprised. It was not expected. So, yeah.
Well,
how about you, Cara?
I don't know why you're surprised. It's a very good book. It's a wonderful story. I love Aki. Okay, for me, I guess professionally and probably for my life, because this is what I do, is that I've always written a series. The Aimée Leduc series, 19 books. Now it's going to be 20. And I missed one around this month, so I have to do 21 anyway. So I never knew I was writing a series. And then I was writing a series when Bronwyn's mother, Soho, asked me, well, Cara, you're writing a series, aren't you? What about the dog? What about the apartment? Well, wait, where's Amy going next? So I sort of fell into it, a contract, a book at a time. We just kept going. And always so many people, as Naomi knows, so many of our colleagues have written in the mystery world. They've written standalones, they've written several series. I'm just thinking Kent Kruger, who's like saying, Cara, why are you, don't you ever want to do a standalone? And I'm like, yeah, Kent, but compared to your wonderful standalone, I don't know. And then one time with Bouchercon, Lee Child in the bar, I go, how do you feel about standalones, Lee? He goes, why are you asking me? Do it, if you want to do it. I'm like, okay. And then I really felt afraid. Okay, I did. I love going to Paris. I sort of had this comfort zone. When I found this story in this footnote in the history book, I wanted to know what happened, right? I wanted to know where this story would go. And I knew it would go somewhere, and I knew there was a real story behind it. I could only fictionalize it. So I was driven. I just had to do this. And Juliet said, you need to do this. Finish this A and go on to it. And I was scared. I remember I called Kent Kruger and I said, why are you calling? This is great. Juliet wants your book. Do it. Just Soho will be behind you. And he goes, but you need to be okay. You need to feel that you can spread your wings. And I said, that's scary, right? To spread your wings. And he goes, that's right. So I decided to spread my wings, and I could always fall, but you don't know until you try. So I think that was really empowering for me to write something, because for 20 years I've been so intimate with Aimée Leduc. I sort of felt I was being unfaithful there for a little bit. It's sort of the way it happened. And I think that, I hope, has helped me grow professionally, in writing and looking at things, and realizing there could always be another, right? Right, Naomi? You've written several series. So.
I think for me, this kind of marks my era or time period of writing historicals. So I'm planning to kind of concentrate the rest of my writing career, at least right now, on doing historicals. So
wow. But I love Leilani, and Hawaii. Yeah. Giving that to my husband when he goes next month. I kind of love her, just.
Yeah, I won't close the door on anything. The second one is coming out in March, An Eternal Lay. Yeah, so you can look at that. It's a really cute cover. You could see the cover online. Yeah.
All right. Well, we've done it, ladies. Congrats again to Naomi for her new book. Thank you so much, Cara, for being here. Thanks to those of you watching. We have signed book plates. Information order is in the comments. And I think that is all for this evening. Thank you again. It's so nice talking with you. I miss seeing you in person, and these virtual events are not the same, but it's so good to at least see friendly faces.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. Yeah, Left Coast for sure.
Left Coast, right, McKenna?
Okay. Let's do it. All right.
Let's do it. All right. Thank you so much. Good luck, Naomi.